What's up guys, I'm Random Frank P, and today we have a very simple step-by-step guide on how to build a gaming PC in 2021 in less than 10 minutes, taking all of your hardware components right into the final build. What we're going to do is I'll introduce everything to you guys, show you what we're going to be using, and then we'll put 10 minutes on the clock. So starting off with the hardware, this case is the Lian Li LanCool 2 Mesh, and has a full ATX chassis. It'll give us plenty of room inside the build, plus it's also great for airflow and temperatures with their mesh inclusions. Our CPU is the AMD Ryzen 7 5800X for our all AMD build. This boasts 8 cores and 16 threads with a 4.7 GHz max clock speed. Keeping that cool is an AIO from NZXT, the X53, and depending on your CPU, you may have a stock cooler that comes included with it. We're going to be using this for this guide. Then we have our motherboard, the ASRock X570 Taichi. Next is our RAM. We have 64 gigs of G.Skill Trident Z RGB Neo RAM. Then our big boy AMD Radeon RX 6900 XT from ASRock. This from their Phantom gaming lineup of graphics cards. Our drive of choice for blazing speeds is going to be a 1TB stick of a Samsung 980 NVMe SSD. This is going to be our boot drive, but I'll also show you where SSDs get installed if you have one of those as well. Then lastly, our power supply, an EVGA 850GA Supernova. This is a modular gold-rated PSU at 850 watts. All our components were supplied by today's sponsor, Micro Center, which has always been one of my favorite places to visit, which is why you'll hear often described as tech heaven. They have everything you need to cover all your tech bases, from desktops, laptops, monitors, TVs, networking equipment, all your PC hardware, peripherals, you name it, they have it at their 25 locations across the US. And one of the cool things with their site is the Micro Center Custom PC Builder. You can go to configure the best PC for your budget. This tool gives you a visual and detailed spec breakdown of all your hardware right in front of you. It checks for compatibility issues so you're not buying the wrong stuff for your PC. It lets you find current stock at your nearest Micro Center location. You can then add it to your cart and even arrange same-day in-store pickup. Plus, there's an option to pay for same-day pro assembly if you want one of their expert technicians to build it for you in-store. Think of this as PC part picker, but with hardware you can actually add to your cart and instantly start your build right there. So everything, all the hardware you see in today's video will be listed for you in the description down below from Micro Center, and there's even a coupon code for a free pair of wireless headphones. All right, we're gonna start off that 10-minute step-by-step guide for you now, because who has an hour to sit down and learn how to do this? But there's no right or wrong order to do a lot of this stuff in. This is just a way that I've done over the past few years that makes it a lot easier and simplified for me. So let's start it off. All right, so starting off our build with the motherboard. This is essentially the main hub where most of our components will connect to bring the PC to life. And during the first few steps of this build, I do recommend keeping the motherboard along with the foam or protective packaging that it came with, just so you're not scratching the bottom or chipping it during this whole process. Then next, we can just roll right into one of the most important and easiest steps, which is installing our CPU. Our 5800X will need to be handled with care, because not only is this the brain of our computer, but the bottom has hundreds of tiny little pins that could get damaged or bent, and you want to avoid that at all costs, literally and figuratively. On our motherboard, there's going to be a little lever near the chipset. Simply just pull that out and up to open the socket for our CPU. Now what you want to do is align the CPU with the arrow on the motherboard. You'll see a tiny little marker on the CPU that indicates the orientation of how to install it. This may look slightly different on your motherboard. Some will show a circle, for example, but the marker will be pretty clear to you. Simply line up your CPU and carefully lower it into place. You need zero force here. You don't want to physically push it down. Just lay it gently, and if aligned properly, it'll fall right in. Then lower that lever again to secure it into place. Now we can install our RAM. We have 2 sticks of 32 gigs each, and this step is very easy, but pay attention because depending on your particular set, installation may vary. So the DIMM slots are labeled accordingly, and since we have just 2 sticks here, we want to actually install them in the 2nd and 4th slot, not the 1st and 2nd or 1st and 3rd, which seems like that's what you would want to do, but it will lead to major boot issues if you install them in the improper slot. I recommend resorting to your motherboard's guide. Every motherboard can be labeled differently here, and some may recommend other slots, but just check your guide first. But obviously, if we had all 4 sticks here, we can just fill the slots with no worry. Now, since we're installing in slots 2 and 4, first up, open the slot with a plastic clip on top, line up the teeth on the bottom of the RAM with the DIMM slot, and then apply even pressure to the north and south side of the stick until you hear and physically see it click into place. It may seem like you're pressing too hard at first, but don't worry. If you do have it lined up properly, it will take a little bit of force to get it to click down so it's secured. Now, while that motherboard guide is handy, since we have an NVMe drive, you'll see labeled inside near the PCIe 1 lane is the M.2 1 slot, meaning this is where we want to install our drive since the motherboard reads this first with priority. However, as you can see with our X570 Taichi, they do have a shroud over that area. So we have 3 screws holding this down that we're going to have to remove, and this shroud is pretty much just for visual aesthetics, so the motherboard looks cleaner overall. You can see they even have like a little gear design on it. But this is going to act as a heatsink as well for M.2 slots underneath. Once all 3 of those screws are out, you can just lift it up to reveal the additional slots. Then the install is simple really. You just line up the notch on the right side of our NVMe key and slide it into place, much like we do with our RAM install, and when it's properly in, you'll hear a slight click sound. Then using the included screw with our motherboard, secure that down as well. Now we can reinstall that shroud, but like I said, it's acting as a heatsink, so remove the corresponding piece of tape on the thermal pad. This will then lay back on our M.2 drive to help dissipate the heat. Once it's back in place, reinstall the 4 shroud screws. Alright, now we're going to move this all over to our case and get the install going. But first, your case most likely has a tiny box inside the styrofoam that it came with, or somewhere inside the case itself. Inside our LANCOL 2 mesh, there's a box of mounting hardware and cable ties inside the drive cage underneath, so remove that before you start building. Because in order to mount your hardware, you need the screws that come with it. The screws do not come with your motherboard. So depending on your motherboard form factor, whether ATX, ITX, or micro ITX, the mounting points will differ inside, but most modern cases do come with pre-installed mounting posts, as well as an indicator on which posts are for which motherboard. Since ours is ATX, we'll be mounting it on the outer posts. Thankfully, our motherboard has a pre-installed I/O shield, but if yours doesn't, it's inside the box with your motherboard, and it looks something like this. To install it, just line it up in the cutout in the back of your PC case. This tool will just pop right into place if you apply pressure on all 4 sides. And trust me, do this now before you install your motherboard, or it's going to be a giant pain to do afterwards. But since ours has it pre-installed in the motherboard itself, that'll give us an easy sort of guide to line up the backside of our case, because once that's aligned, then we're all lined up on the mounting post as well to begin screwing in the 9 screws to keep the motherboard secured down to the case. The trick here is to screw until you start to feel some resistance, then stop, because you don't want to over tighten these and chance cracking your motherboard at all. Again, the screws for everything will come with the case, so if you need help picking between which screws are for which posts, there should be some sort of manual or guide to kind of break it down for you. Next, it's time to install the graphics card, and this is pretty easy, and once you're at this point, we're almost done, believe it or not. But once you unbox your GPU, remove any protective film or plastic that may be on it, including any rubber pieces that are on the PCIe connector, as well as on the back side. There's always some sort of plastic covers for the HDMI and display ports. Remove those before installation as well, and they just pop right out. In order to install our GPU in the top PCIe 16 slot, which is where you always want to mount your GPU, you'll need to remove the left side brackets on the back side of the case, which line up with the thickness of your GPU, whether that's 2 slots or 3 slots. Just these little thumb screws keeping them in place, and removing them is now going to give your GPU access to the backside for your display cables and stuff. Once you have your GPU mounted, again, just like our RAM install, when you line it up, it'll properly pop into place, you'll hear and feel it click, then you can reuse those screws to secure it back to the chassis. This will make sure the graphics card stays mounted and won't come loose at all when you're plugging in your cables in the back. Now we're going to install our power supply and get the cables ready for all of our hardware that we're going to be using. Not everything is installed yet because we still need to hook up our AIO, but prepping these cables now will make it just a lot easier in the end. And since our EVGA power supply is modular, that means we only hook up the cables we actually need. This will help cut down a lot of the cable clutter on the bottom of the case, and it's going to be better for cable management. So if you have the choice, I recommend going modular. You'll see on the back side is all our slots for the cables, which is where they plug into. This is what just branches out and gives all our components power. Your PSU will come with a bunch of different cables. Odds are you won't need them all, which is the point of this being modular, but each cable will be labeled, whether VGA for graphics, CPU for the CPU, NB for motherboard, and SATA and peripheral for giving additional hardware power, like hard drives, SSDs, coolers, RGB hubs, stuff like that. Then on the opposite end of each cable, it'll say PSU, letting you know which side gets connected where. So for our motherboard, we'll need that long 24-pin cable. Our GPU will need 24 pins as well, with 3 different 8-pin VGA cables. Then our CPU on top of the motherboard will need a 12-pin connector. Before you plug in your hardware, I recommend mounting the PSU to the case first. That way you're not tugging the cables loose or moving the power supply every single time. Again, the screws for this come inside the case. You just need 4 screws to mount the PSU. Now, the reason I haven't installed the AIO yet is because 9 times out of 10 in the past, especially when I'm using a top-mounted radiator like this, I always install that before I remember to plug in the CPU cables. So from our PSU, I recommend doing that now just to get it out of the way, and we'll do the rest in a minute. But before the AIO, we introduce those cables as well. I want to tie up some loose ends because your case also comes with a few cables that still need to be hooked up as well. This is for the I/O ports on your PC, as well as system fans and any RGB cables if your case has RGB. And it's 2021, odds are it does. So on the bottom of your motherboard is a super cramped area. This is where the majority of things have to get plugged in, unfortunately. Things like your HD audio cable for your case gets plugged in down here. This is for your headphone and microphone jack, as well as the power switch, reset switch, power LED indicator on your case. These little cables are super annoying. Again, I suggest checking your motherboard guide on where these connectors go because every motherboard has this in a different location. Oftentimes it's grouped up with other connectors. So plug those in. Since our case has RGB, we have a 3-pin RGB header in addition to a 4-pin RGB cable if you want to install other RGB components. Then, since we have 3 installed fans on the case, we want to look for fan headers all around the motherboard. They look like this, they're spread out, and they're labeled CPU fans. So depending on how many fans you have in your case or how many you're going to be using, you want to populate these connectors. So once all the I/O cables are plugged into the motherboard, we can now get to the AIO, which is personally just easiest to save for last, like I said. Unless of course you are using a stock cooler or something that's really easy. But since AIOs are much better for, cooling and stuff, and they're more common nowadays, especially with a demanding CPU, I figured I'd demo this for the build. Unscrew those 4 screws on each side of the CPU. Those little brackets are where the stock cooler would usually go, but we don't need that. Now since the X53 has pre-installed thermal paste in the bottom, we won't need to reapply more, which is always good. The cooler you buy will come with its own mounting hardware and instructions on which brackets and screws to use, so resort to the guide for that, as this X53 guide won't make sense to you unless you have this exact cooler. But every cooler will screw into the motherboard bracket underneath using thumb screws just to keep it down so it's secure to the motherboard and not moving around. And just like our motherboard screws, you don't want to over tighten these during your AIO install because remember, the CPU is underneath this and you don't want to damage that with excessive force. Once your AIO is installed, now we're going to mount our fans and our radiator. Again, it's just a general guide, so if you have different components, these steps won't all be the same, but my rad is going to be mounted on the top of the case since we already have 3 fans in the front. Using the included screws, we'll mount this to the cutouts on the top of our LAN Cool 2. The X53 will need a SATA power cable to connect it to our power supply, which is why, like I said earlier, I recommended planning ahead and connecting them then. So depending on your cooler, you may or may not have to do this. We'll also have to connect the 2 fans for this cooler, as well as a USB power cable to our motherboard, but for the 100th time, depending on your hardware, these steps will all vary. Then we can finish off the rest of our power supply cables. Plug in the GPU with those 3 8-pin cables, as well as a 24-pin motherboard cable. Then just like that, with everything installed and connected, you're good to go and you've just completed your build. Go through and remove any remaining protective films on some of your hardware components, as well as the film on your case panels. Grab the power cable that came with your PSU, plug it in on the backside. Don't forget, flip up the power switch so it's turned on, and then hit the power button on the top of your case. If everything went according to plan and your PC didn't explode, you'll see the RGB turn on, fans will start spinning, and your GPU will power up as well, letting you connect this to a monitor to begin installing Windows. And then lastly, now that the build's done, this is an optional step, but definitely recommended, that's cable management. Odds are all those cables are still just dangling in the back, unorganized. You do want to keep them grouped together and as tidy as possible. That way, if you have to go back and change out hardware, it'll be organized. You can see which cable is which and where it goes. Also, you want to avoid the cable, pushing up against the backside of the panel and popping out. So our case does come with some shrouds, which keeps the cables nicely against the case and it keeps all the cables hidden. Then like I said before, since we use an M.2 drive, we don't have an SSD here, but if you do have one of those, installation is really simple. Our case has multiple points so you can mount those, including on the back side of the panel, as well as this little mesh panel that folds out from the case. So your case will have varying mounting spots as well. But your motherboard will come with these tiny L-shaped SATA cables. You connect one of these to your SSD, then to your motherboard. The SATA port's usually on the right side of your motherboard, near where the graphics card is. And then from your power supply, using one of those SATA cables, it's a longer L-shaped cable. You connect one of those to the SSD as well, and that'll give it power. Alright guys, that'll wrap it up for our 10-minute step-by-step guide on how to build a PC in 2021. Hope you enjoyed. Like I said, I'll have all the hardware components we used listed for you in the description down below. If this video helped you out, give it a big thumbs up to show your support. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at RandomFrankP. And last, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Hope you all enjoyed. Have a good day.